synagogue, and welcome.
And we're just recording.
Oh, I'm sorry. And welcome guests throughout the year. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Helene Herman, who will talk about the Shanghai Ghetto. Take it away, Helene.
Okay, you can see my screen, yes?
Yes.
Okay, that's what we need. There we go. So, China, Jews, I always thought it was the food connection. And it wasn't until I was at a fundraiser down in Florida, in Fort Lauderdale in 1999, honoring the righteous among the nations, that I first learned about what we know is, and we call the Shanghai Ghetto. It was there that I met the grandson of one of the story's heroes, Dr. Ho. And later on, I started traveling to Shanghai on business. And that's when I really began my journey of discovery, studying what is commonly called the Shanghai Ghetto. It was actually called the designated area for Jewish refugees. Between 1933 and 1941, and continuing through World War II, Shanghai became a modern-day Noah's Ark and one of the world's great Jewish cities. Now, the estimates vary. Some Jews came to Shanghai basically on the way to someplace else. And with the approximate 25,000 Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis coming through Shanghai, most but not all stayed. In the designated area for stateless refugees, about 20,000 Jewish refugees lived harmoniously with Chinese and to a degree with some Japanese. And by the time the war ended in 1945, most had survived. Whoops. So we're going to go back in history. You may remember some of these things from world history. And we're going to review some of them. So there was a little war, probably a footnote in world history, the Opium Wars, where the British were trying to gain control of the opium trade in China. And after the war ended, you started having the establishment of a French concession and an international settlement. And then later on, you had the Japanese coming in. But you had imperialism creating a city within a city. This non-Chinese section was not under Chinese jurisdiction. It was a free port, and it was all about money. Now, that little arrow, that's Hankou, an area of about 1 square mile where the Shanghai Ghetto was later established. Can you please silence anybody who is speaking? Because I'm hearing people talking. It's a little distracting.
I will mute all again, but you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay. As I tell people, I'm old, and sometimes I get distracted and forget words like the and. Okay, so between, there were different waves of Jewish immigration to Shanghai. But between the period of 1845 and 1941, you had about 40,000 Jews who came to China for business development or safe haven, a combination of immigrants and refugees fleeing oppression. So the first wave were Sephardic Baghdadi Jews, basically Middle Eastern Jews, not all came from Baghdad. And they were under the British crown, and they had British passports. They came via India, they came via Hong Kong, and they were professionals and extremely wealthy. They were stockbrokers, they were involved in retail and real estate and import and export, particularly the opium trade. The community grew, but always remained very small and always remained very powerful. By 1895, you had a whopping 175 Baghdadi Jews, and at its height, never more than 800. Now you see the guy in little turban, that's David Sassoon, a very charitable Orthodox Jew who passed on his commitment to tzedakah to his descendants. But the entire Sephardic community was very, very much into establishing and supporting charities. This is the bund that the Baghdadis built, the heart of business and government in Shanghai then and now. What you see at the top was an etching done around 1900, and the bottom was a photograph that I actually took. I think that one was in 2008. The bund was established by these wealthy Sephardic Jews, and this was a contribution to the development of modern Shanghai, which remains the financial capital of China. The big difference, which kind of freaked me out when I first saw it, was these very European-looking buildings. It could be Munich, it could be Paris, it could be Vienna, with the red flags flying on top. And it has a very European look. That was the first impression that later immigrants and refugees had of their home. Again, a little history, another footnote, the Russo-Japanese War. You probably don't even remember it. Well, this event really shaped later events in the Jewish community in Shanghai. This was the height of imperialism, and Russia was under the Tsar, was trying to make inroads into Manchuria and China, and the Japanese were doing the same, and they were trying to protect the Pacific Rim. Now, along comes Jacob Schiff. He's a very wealthy German Jewish American financier, banker. Meanwhile, back home in New York, he is dealing with the influx of refugees fleeing the terrible pogroms in Russia. So the Japanese approached Schiff, and he responded by financing Japan along with some fellow Jewish bankers. They financed Japan in their war against Russian aggression. Schiff and the other banker friends did this directly in response to anti-Semitism in Tsarist Russia, particularly the tales of horror that they heard of the pogroms. Schiff helped influence Japanese attitude towards the Jews, who they saw as powerful and rich. And we're going to see this is important because this perception was to the advantage of a Jewish refugee community. The next group that came were the Russians. A few Russian Jews fled the pogroms to Shanghai in the first decade of the 20th century, but most fleeing the pogroms ended up in North America. Between the end of World War I in 1917 through the early 20s, you had about 5,000 Ashkenazi Russian Jews coming to Shanghai, along with about 15,000 non-Jewish white Russians. These refugees were fleeing oppression and the army, both Tsarist army and the Red Army, and fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution. The white Russians primarily were fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution. And they came to Shanghai from Siberia, from Manchuria, and an area in North China called Harbin, which had a very large Jewish population, even in the early 20th century. Now, the Russian Revolution, most of us think of it ending in 1917, and actually lasted in Siberia until 1923, and you had many Jews coming then. And a second smaller group came in 1931 after Japan conquered Manchuria. Now, these Russian Ashkenazi Jews were very different from the Sephardim. The Sephardim, the Baghdadis, were very, very British gentlemen. They spoke English and they supported the crown. The Ashkenazi Russians spoke Yiddish and Russian, and they'd suffered a lot of persecution. And they were people who did not have an actual homeland. So the Ashkenazi Russian Jews were capitalists. They hated the Tsar and they hated Lenin equally. And they came to Shanghai and they developed retail businesses and a lot of businesses in the hospitality industry, boarding houses, hotels, bars, and bordellos, and they catered primarily to the non-Chinese, including the Japanese. Now, the Sephardic was still the controlling influence, these wealthy British citizens, and they didn't mix much with the Russians. And the Russian Jews ran their own stores and restaurants. They had their own newspapers in Yiddish and Russian. They had their own music and theater. When they first came to Shanghai, they settled in Hangzhou, which was primarily a Japanese area, and then quickly moved into the beautiful tree-lined French Quarter. There they founded the Jewish Music Club, where they introduced some of Shanghai's Chinese elite to classical music. Now, there were some conflicts, mostly religious issues, but like all expatriates, the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi Jews kept two classes defined by ethnic and economic lines. I mean, I lived in New York City, but I didn't hang out with Michael Bloomberg, except for one breakfast, but that's another story. So they come to Shanghai, the rules are few and the opportunities are endless. There were also, as I said before, many of the non-Jewish white Russians who brought along with them Russian anti-Semitism. The only anti-Semitism in Shanghai was actually perpetrated by the non-Jewish refugees. But they did join together in a common bond of charity and education. The Baghdadi Sephardim, following the examples set by not only David Sassoon, but also the Kadoorie family. And the Kadoories supported schools, not just finding a school in China, but also in India, Hong Kong, and then later Shanghai. And they worked together. They worked together to help those in need. I'm sorry about that. Establishing schools and a cemetery. So one of the things that the Baghdadis brought were Boy Scout troops and Girl Guide troops. We would know Girl Guides as as Girl Scouts. And they also established a Jewish recreation club. Sports were very important throughout the history of Jewish Shanghai. Physical fitness, very important. And then in 1928, you actually had the B'nai B'rith coming to Shanghai, and they worked very hard to bring the two groups together. And how did they do it? Through the children. And the third wave, which is why you're probably here tonight, were those fleeing the Nazis. Again, the numbers that stayed in Shanghai vary. So I'm going to use 20,000. That's about the average between the varying estimates. And the reason that it varies is that exit visas to leave Europe were generally for heads of household. So you could have two people and then 3 half people. Those are the children. You also had many children who were born in Shanghai, but very, very few Germans in particular had the foresight to leave Germany early. The large wave of refugees came between 37 and 39, and some came in 40. And then finally, the Japanese closed the city to the refugees in 1941. So you had thousands of refugees coming with no documents, no means of support. Some didn't stay. Some were very fortunate, and they were able to pass through en route to the Americas, to what was then Palestine, or Australia, or even England. And my Israeli son-in-law's Berlin banker uncle went through Shanghai to settle in London. But it was very, very difficult for most Europeans to get a visa into any country other than Shanghai, where a visa was not required. So they came in droves as war consumed Europe and other avenues of escape closed. Why Shanghai? Called the Paris, the Far East, the New York of the Orient. The world closed their doors, but Shanghai, they did not require any paperwork. It was a very cosmopolitan city with a low cost of living. It was all about trades, and no visas were required. It was a free port. Now, to get out of Europe, it needed an exit visa. They needed an exit visa, and they needed to prove that they had tickets to leave. There was no passport control. When the Japanese took over after yet another war, the Sino-Japanese War, which ended in 1937, there was no passport control, and the Japanese controlled Shanghai, including Hankou, but not the French Quarter and not the international settlement. And Hankou was the Japanese quarter of that international settlement. Now, the rich white Europeans in other areas didn't want the refugees coming anywhere. But in 1938, Japan had a conference, a 5 ministers conference, where they explicitly prohibited the expulsion of Jews in Japan, Manchuria, and China. So the Jews were able to come to Hankou. You might question this, and those of you who think about the terrible treatment of that the Japanese perpetrated on American POWs, you need to separate yourself from that for this presentation, because there was no hatred of Jews by the Japanese. In fact, they thought rich Jews could help them in their plans to dominate the Pacific. So before 41, when the Japanese closed entry, Shanghai was the only place where a foreigner could walk off a ship with no documentation and begin a new life. So until October 1941, Nazi policy officially encouraged Jewish immigration. They wanted the Jews to make their countries Jew-free. Initially, some Jews, particularly heads of household, were thrown into camps like Dachau, but they could get out if their family produced exit visas to a specific destination and proof of passage. After the Anschluss, the Austrian annexation, March of 38, and then particularly after Kristallnacht in November 38, the Jews started scrambling to get out. The exit visa and transportation were very expensive propositions, and there was a lot of bribery. The earliest refugees were very wealthy. They had to pay, all refugees had to pay very heavy exit taxes. They could only take with them 10 Deutschmarks, about $4 today, but they could take personal effects, and many women were very clever in smuggling out their jewels. Some families were able to ship household goods in advance, but they often got lost or were confiscated. Now, there were two ways of traveling. They could go in first or second class on German or Italian ships, on sea voyages initially lasting 23 days, but then when the Suez Canal closed to access ships, up to 72 days around the Cape of Good Hope. That was a far cry from my grandparents being in steerage. They also came through the Soviet Union via the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Vladivostok, then to Harbin in northwest China, to Shanghai, and in some cases through Japan and then to Shanghai. Now here's one of my great heroes, and I had the privilege of meeting his grandson. As the majority of the world's nations refused to budge from their restrictive immigration policies, reaffirmed at the Evian Conference in July of 1938, including America, Ho stood his ground. Unlike fellow diplomats, he issued exit visas to Shanghai to anybody who requested them, even if they were able to go someplace else. And he never financially extorted Jews, unlike other diplomats. He did what he did because he felt it was the right thing to do. He had many Jewish friends, and he absolutely refused to follow the instructions of his superior, the Chinese ambassador to Berlin, Chen Ji. So the access occurred, the access between Germany, Japan, and Italy occurred in September 1940. But prior to this, the Nazis were actually working on a Chinese alliance. Chiang Kai-shek sent his son to train in a German military school. And this man actually led a panzer division in the Anschluss into Austria. This is Chiang Kai-shek's son. Now, hoping to cement closer ties between China and Germany, Chen Ji forbade Ho to issue these visas on a large scale. And basically, this man did what was right. He refused to follow orders. And many that he helped by issuing these visas reached Shanghai by boat from Italy or overland through the Soviet Union. But many used their visas to come to alternative destinations, including what was then British-controlled Palestine, a lucky few, the Japanese-controlled Philippines, which actually rescued many Jews, Cuba, and elsewhere. After the fall of China to the communists, Ho left China in 1949 and went to Taiwan, where he had a long diplomatic career. He was actually ambassador to Egypt, Mexico, Bolivia, and Colombia. 1973, he retired when the government of Taiwan denied him a pension on very questionable grounds. Supposedly, he had disrespected Chiang Kai-shek's son. Well, Ho ended up in San Francisco with his children, and he kept his story quiet. He didn't tell his story until after his death in 1997 at the age of 96. And at his funeral, people questioned the fact that no one from the Taiwanese government recognized it, but Beijing, the government of Communist Beijing, actually sent a wreath. His daughter Manli wrote his obituary, and his story was revealed in that obituary quite by accident. The only story he had ever told her was that he confronted the Gestapo at gunpoint to save his Jewish friends. A curator who was doing an exhibition about diplomatic rescuers read the obituary, contacted Manli. They got together, worked together, went to Israel, and started to uncover the story, corroborated through his survivors and through Yad Vashem. Dr. Ho Fengshan, the Chinese consul general in Vienna, was awarded Righteous Among the Nations for his humanitarian courage in issuing exit visas in Vienna in spite of orders from his superior. He is honored in China. This plaque is at Ohel Moshe, the Jewish museum in Shanghai, and he is honored in Israel. But most American Jews never heard of him and don't know his story. So this is a video that appeared on Chinese news TV. This tells the story of Dr. Ho and the survival of Jewish refugees and the friendship established between them and the Chinese in Shanghai. It may not be known in America, but it is told in China, and this is in English.
87-year-old Lily Feliz lived in Kfar Saba, Israel. She was in primary school before World War II broke out in 1939.
My father was also in a travel agency, and one day he said, I have a passage for 2.5 persons, are you ready? And so my father agreed, of course, and very quickly. And so we came with this ship, what you've seen, through Italy, through the Africa, until Hong Kong, and then Shanghai.
Shanghai was an important safe haven for Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. By 1941, nearly 20,000 European Jews had found shelter there. Iraqi-born Jewish scholar Ezra Yahaska specializes in this time period.
The Chinese accepted so nicely the refugees, only one country, only one city. So it's important, isn't it? The new generation in China will know something about this wonderful story.
Yad Vashem is Israel's official memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. It was established in 1953. The center also honors non-Jews who risked their lives, liberty, or positions to save Jews. More than 24,000 individuals have been recognized as righteous among the nations. One is Ho Fengshan, a Chinese diplomat in Vienna.
Having papers saying that you can go to China in many cases meant the difference between life and death. And we will always remember Ho for his bravery, for his generosity, and for his nobility. And this is something which will connect China and the Jewish people.
How many Jews were saved through Ho's actions is unknown. But given that Ho issued nearly 2,000 visas in the first half year at his post, the number may be in the thousands.
I still, compared to what people and Jews had to go through the Holocaust in Europe, we were very, very lucky that we saved our lives. That's my feeling. But I think one should know everything one should know. Why not?
Today, Yad Vashem is the second most visited Israeli tourist site, with about 1 million visitors a year. It represents not only memory, but also the commitment. Never again. Donald Shen, CCTV.
I played the whole thing for that last line, never again. So the Japanese remembered Jacob Schiff's help, and this man is one of several Japanese who helped Jews get to Shanghai. Chiun Sugihara, also known as Sempo, and he was a Japanese diplomat in Lithuania. He was also a spy for Japan. This was the time of the Soviet and Nazi non-aggression pact, and Japan was suspicious about that Hitler and Stalin were not being completely honest. Again, this was 1939 to 1940, before the Axis Agreement. So he reported on troop movements to Japan. He also had lived in Harbin early in his career and developed a knowledge and respect for the Jewish community. He helped thousands of Jews leave Lithuania by issuing transit visas to refugees through Japan and Japanese territory, with a final destination being the island of Curacao. Now, Curacao did not require a visa, but they did require a landing permit, a requirement that was purposely omitted on all travel documents. Sugihara got together with the Dutch consul in Kaunas, Lithuania, to issue Curacao visas to anyone who requested them. Now, the Jews who escaped were refugees from both northern Poland and Lithuania, particularly the Orthodox rabbinical community. And they all had to go through Japan, and most of them ended up in Kobe, where they were well treated until the Japanese government sent them to Shanghai just 2 months before Pearl Harbor. None of the visa holders actually ever reached. They never reached Curacao. And the little aside is that one of the Japanese government officials who assisted the Jews who were in the holding pattern in Kobe, Japan, and made sure that they were taken care of and treated with respect, ended up going to Israel and converting to Judaism later on. Little aside. But they didn't just save people. They saved heritage. To me, that's important. And I've done this enough, so I stop crying when I read this, but occasionally I get verklempt. But among this group, all 400 teachers and students of the Mir Yeshiva, one of the most prestigious and largest yeshivas in Europe, were able to continue their studies in Shanghai. So, and it was a 6-week period, and Sugihara just started granting visas after consulting with his family, and he did it because it was the right thing. And he violated the stringent Japanese requirements and issued 10-day travel visas to transit through Japan. Now, he went to the Soviet officials, and they had no problem agreeing to let the Jews travel on the Trans-Siberian Railroad at 5 times the standard ticket price, provided they had a final destination. Sugihara continued to handwrite visas even after the consulate closed, and worked together with his wife 18 hours a day. And the visas that were for Jews as heads of household who could take their family, it was estimated that between 2,200 and 6,000 Jews escaped because of these visas. On his way to the train to leave, he continued writing visas, and even on the train was throwing visas out into the crowd of these desperate people, even as the train pulled out. Finally, they were throwing out blank sheets of paper with a seal and his signature, and they were written over by these desperate refugees, and some of them actually worked. So what happened to Sugihara? Well, after the war, he left foreign service, and he ended up working menial jobs. And then in 1968, a small miracle happened. Joshua Nishri, who was the economic attaché to the Israeli embassy in Tokyo and one of the Sugihara beneficiaries, finally located and contacted him. In 1969, Sugihara went to Israel, where he was warmly greeted by the government. His beneficiaries in Israel began to lobby heavily for his recognition by Yad Vashem, and it did not occur until 1984, when he was recognized as righteous among the nations. By that time, he was too ill to travel, so his wife and his youngest son went on his behalf, and he died the following year, the only Japanese to be so honored. Now, his Dutch partner took that guy until 1997 to be honored by Yad Vashem. Now, as we all know, 2020 was a pretty bad year for the world. But before the pandemic, the government of Lithuania declared 2020 as the year of Chun Sugihara. It has been estimated as many as 100,000 people are alive today because of the Sugihara visas. And none of them ever got to Curacao. So the refugees come, and what do they see? They see the bund, and it looks like, oh, they could be in Munich, they could be in Vienna. This is a very European place. They could be in Warsaw. And then they settle in affordable Hankyu, opened to them by the Japanese, who controlled it. They were helped by the Baghdadis and the Russian Jews, and an organization known as the Joint Distribution Committee, an American organization that helps refugees today as well. About half of the refugees stayed in Hankyu, and the rest, if they could afford it, moved on to the French concession. Now, the biggest issue was housing. It was very crowded. Plus, the conditions were squalid. Most families lived in one room. It was hard to find work. And the refugees stayed within their bubble. They didn't interact much with or were welcomed by the white international community. The Japanese were not inherently anti-Semitic. They disagreed with the Nazis on Aryan superiority, which is no surprise. They remembered Jacob Schiff. They had very positive dealings with the Baghdadi and the Russian Jews. They thought rich Jews could help. They had read the protocols of the elders of Zion, and they viewed it positively. They viewed Jews as industrious, cooperative, productive, and potential allies in controlling the Pacific. They were also very paranoid about Jewish power, and that was fueled by Nazi propaganda. And they were concerned that Jews might undermine them, but they were also hopeful that they could help. Now, these Jewish refugees coming to Shanghai were not your poor shtetl Jews. They were primarily educated German, Austrian, and scholarly Eastern Europeans. Now, Japanese, as well as Chinese culture, they admire hard work and a dedication to learning. There was much admiration for the people of the book, but there was also concern about perceived power, and they were still afraid that the Jews would take them over. So they went to Hankyu, which was known as Jewtown, formerly a lot of Russian Jews. They were met at the pier and the train station by trucks by the relief organizations. This was not, it was unfortunately in a PBS show many years ago, they showed the same photo and they said they were taking them to a concentration camp. That is not true. They were going to be processed because they came there with nothing and no knowledge of the language. Victor Sassoon established and supported an international committee for European immigrants that was run by a Hungarian named Paul Kamar. But this was great culture shock. They were all decked out in their travel clothes. Remember, we used to get dressed to fly on a plane? So they're wearing their suits and dresses, going from first class luxury to squalor. Given tin plates to get their first meager meals and settling into dormitories with communal kitchens. Life was not a bed of roses, and the refugee influx started becoming overwhelming, and the Japanese and the existing Jewish community worked together to avoid total chaos. The Jewish community started registering refugees and arranging for internal passports, birth certificates, and unfortunately, death certificates. There was actually a pushback for a while by relief organizations in the Jewish community. They were afraid that they couldn't sustain these people, so they tried to curtail refugees from coming in. U.S. State Department, that old anti-Semite Cordell Hull in 1939 actually went to the Nazis and asked them to stop allowing German ships to take Jews to Shanghai. But relief organizations, the black market, and even some sympathetic Japanese officials helped until the port was closed in 1941, and the Jews had continued to come in. Charity came from within and without. You had a lot of relief coming from the Baghdadis and the Russian Jews until 41. Victor Sassoon, he funded refugees with money to start businesses. You see these women on the bottom sewing sheets. People needed sheets. And he brought in bales of cotton from his factories in India and set up little factories there. There were some issues of corruption in Jewish aid organizations, but in 1941, the JDC fixed this and took over. There was also an issue with the Yiddish-speaking Russians favoring the Poles and the Litvaks over the non-Yiddish-speaking Germans and Austrians. Although they were really challenged, about 70% of the refugees found a way to survive, and people figured out how to start businesses. So if people can't afford blades, we'll go into business sharpening old blades. The challenges were many. Kitchen facilities were shared, very primitive. There was a lack of food, plus you couldn't eat raw vegetables or fruit. Water wasn't drinkable, and all water had to be boiled. You actually went to the store run by Chinese to buy boiled water. Terrible sanitary conditions. These were people who had Western plumbing in Europe, and now they had chamber pots that every morning Chinese came by with their wagons and picked them up, human waste that was sold as fertilizer. It was very hot and humid in the summer. Believe me, I've been there in July, and there's no heating in the winter. It was very, very crowded, as I've said. And when you ask survivors what they remember, you hear over and over again, lack of privacy and the crowding. There was also a reluctance on the part of many to get charity or to go to the soup kitchen. And then there were about 3,000 who ended up being stuck in the dormitory called Jaime, the refugee centers throughout the war, where they faced the 3 H's, hunger, heat, and humidity. But see that picture? In Shanghai, you could practice as a Jew, and that never stopped. And then Pearl Harbor changed things. But the Jews of Shanghai still got by, except for those who had British passports. They were interred as enemy aliens. In fact, I know somebody who lives in my community whose father was an American diplomat in Shanghai, and he was put into a prison camp. Now, psychologically, most refugees saw Shanghai as a temporary stop to get to the Golden Hyena, to get to America, or even Canada. They never thought they'd be there for a long time. And as bad as it was, they always knew they had it so much better than the Chinese. They were not treated as the enemy. They were not beaten and tortured like the Chinese. And the Jewish refugees tried to live together as best as they could. Mostly secular, but they worked hard to accommodate the religious Polish and Lithuanian Jews, somehow even providing kosher food. You had schools, you had Ort, which is still around today, teaching trades. You had a Kadori school that was founded in November 1939, and the Jewish Educational Society, and lots of sports, and of course, scouting. Scouting was always very popular. So I said in 1941, JDC, any of the corruption was gone. An American leader named Laura Margolis came to face chaos and corruption. And she basically took charge and got rid of it. And one of the issues was with Pearl Harbor, America said you can't send money to Shanghai. Told JDC they can't send money to Shanghai because that is, it's an enemy territory. So fortunately, Margolis had met a Japanese official named Kuroshiga Inuzuka. She met him socially. Now, some could call him anti-Semitic, but actually my feeling is he had a non-Western view of Jews. And she asked him, he said, could you let me issue loans in exchange for IOUs, which I'll repay at the end of the war, which all those loans were repaid. And he asked her to continue soup kitchens, feeding 8,000 people a day. She was finally interned as an enemy alien for 6 months, February to September 43, then went back to the US, but the soup kitchen stayed open. Now I want to talk about Inuzuka for a little bit. And you may have heard of something called the Fugu Plan. In 1939, Inuzuka and a bunch of his Japanese military and non-military officials went to the government of Japan to recommend that Japan set up an autonomous Jewish region in either Manchuria or in China. Imagine this, Israel and China. And this would be a place for the Jewish refugees from the Nazis to settle, and they would get political and economic autonomy and live as they desire. Strange, huh? The Jews were compared to fugu, a poisonous fish delicacy. You cut out the poison part and you eat the delicious part. The Japanese were cautious, but they thought the Jews could help, and the plan, actually known as the Fugu Plan. They also thought, you're going to love this, that FDR was Jewish, and they got this from Nazi propaganda, that his real name was Rosenfeld. And they wanted FDR to become an ally. And this is before the Axis was created. They actually approached Rabbi Stephen Wise in New York to go to FDR, and Stephen Wise actually turned away from it. But Inuzuka and other Japanese were instrumental in continuing to allow the Jewish refugees to come into Hankyu until 41. They influenced that 5 ministers conference that prohibited expulsion of Jews. And Inuzuka believed that gaining Jewish favor was crucial because he had read the protocols of the elders of Zion, and he believed that Jews still controlled the world markets. Now, Inuzuka's help in rescuing Jewish refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe was acknowledged by the American Union of Orthodox Rabbis, and that saved him from being tried as a war criminal. He actually went on to establish the Japan-Israel Association and was president of it until his death in 1965. You can't make this stuff up. Truth is stranger than fiction. This is not a good guy. So after Pearl Harbor, Germany just assumed that Japan would start implementing their anti-Semitic policies. So in 1942, July, Colonel Joseph Meisinger was the chief representative of the Gestapo to Japan. It's known as the Butcher of Warsaw. He comes to Shanghai and he meets with the Japanese with his plan for the final solution in Shanghai. So the first thing he's going to do, he tells them to do, is arrest all the Jews in Shanghai in a surprise attack on Rosh Hashanah. Then the final solution would be, 1, set up a concentration camp on an island in the river in Shanghai. And there were later reports from American officials that they found a never-used gas chamber there and actually found canisters of Zyklon B in the warehouses of Bayer, yes, the people who make our aspirin, and Siemens. The second thing, part of the solution, was they'd send the Jews in ships, send them adrift in the sea to die of hunger and thirst, or force them to work themselves to death in salt mines. And the Japanese said categorically no. Why? Well, 1 was a pushback on the Germans because they controlled Shanghai, not Germany. But more than that, there was a cultural issue. See, the Japanese had no inherent history of anti-Semitism. They did not subscribe to Aryan superiority. There was no religious, racial, cultural prejudice against Jews. They admired the culture, fortitude, and of course, the perceived wealth. Japanese didn't want to antagonize the Soviets. There were actually 5,000 Russian Jews in Shanghai, and there was no war between the Soviet Union and Japan until July of 1945, right before Hiroshima. And just in case they lost the war, the Japanese didn't want to antagonize the Jews because, of course, the Jews had major financial worldwide domination. They read it in a book. And Jewish life continues in Vienna, and the Jews all came together, and the cultural disparities disappeared. You had help from the Russian Jews in Harbin as well, and in Kobe, Japan, from various organizations. Now, when the Jews came to Hankyu, Chusan Road had been destroyed in the Sino-Japanese War, but they rebuilt it. Had been destroyed in 1937, and it was rebuilt, and still looks like this today. It's part of what became known as Little Vienna. These Jews were faced with language barriers, poverty, disease, isolation, but they transitioned from being supported by welfare agencies to functioning communities. And cultural life really flourished. Newspapers, theaters, sports teams, on and on and on. These are just some examples of the rich cultural life that you had there. You had periodicals. You actually had 2 medical newsletters in German, English, and Chinese. Lots of publications, again, in German and Yiddish, newspapers. One survivor, whose book I read, recalled 60 plays being produced over the years that he lived in Shanghai. And the Japanese were actually quite impressed by these refugees surviving squalor and poverty. Thanks to the Russian Jews, and I'll get a little more about that later on, you had a radio station plus shortwave radios, and the Japanese never shut it down. Now, a little story associated with the fact that the Japanese did not acquiesce to the German pressure to implement the final solution. So the Japanese military governor of the city sends for the Jewish community leaders, including, of course, the rabbis. And the Japanese governor is curious, and he said, "Why do the Germans hate you so much?" So there's 2 versions of the answer by Rebbe Kalish. Answer 1, they hate us because, like you, we are Orientals. And answer 2, they hate us because we're short and have dark hair. In 1943, into the ghetto. So on the surface, it looks like the Japanese gave in to German pressure. Sorry. They never said this was for Jews. It was always stateless refugees. And the objective was to keep them under surveillance because they had that notion of great power. There are also concerns that the Jews might be spies or would sabotage the war, and that was from Nazi propaganda. Now, the refugees who went to this area were only those who came after 1937. It did not include the 5,000 Russians. It did not include the few Baghdadis who did not have a British passport. And the Jews had to give up their homes outside of Hankyu and sell them to the Japanese in Hankyu at low prices within a deadline. It also provided better housing and the French concession for the Japanese who were living in squalid Hankyu. So February 1943, about half the refugees living outside of Hankyu had to come back. So leave their homes, leave their businesses. They were refugees once again. But this was a different kind of ghetto. It was a ghetto with no wall and coexistence with 100,000 Chinese who lived there. You also still had a number of Japanese living there. Now, this was not Warsaw. This was not like a European ghetto. And although severely malnourished, no one faced enforced starvation or annihilation. The Chinese helped a lot. They gave up rooms to put up refugees. There was a Chinese hospital that saved many lives. And they worked together. Between 1943 and 1945, those were the hardest days. And you had many friendships, particularly among the women. And for the most part, it was self-governed. The Japanese instituted a Baojia system, so the Jews basically self-regulated. This is a trailer from a wonderful 95-minute video simply called the Shanghai Ghetto, and it's free on YouTube.
I came home from school and the Nazi party was marching. Suddenly they said, "How do you the Jews?"
You couldn't get into America, you couldn't get to England, you couldn't get to any of these places because we had no passports, we had no visas.
And soon word got around very quickly that there's a place in the Far East that accepts you without a visa, without papers of any kind. Where are you going? 8,000 miles away.
Shanghai, powerful and decadent, tremendously wealthy and miserably squalid.
Every disease, known or unknown to man, was rampant in epidemic proportions.
There was this very sweet Chinese man who came with his bamboo stick with two little baskets hanging on each side. Became a real friendship with my mother. I noticed that she licked the last bit of butter off the plate, and some just froze to death. And then you'd see in the streets in the morning, little packages wrapped up where the children passed away.
And yet at the same time, they had magazines, they had newspapers, they had theater productions. And they would push the dining room tables together and put mattresses on top, and we would crawl underneath, and that was supposed to be a shelter.
So they focused on their own life and on the misery of life in Shanghai. And lo and behold, after the war, they found out they're living paradise. Compared to what happened to their brother and you, that's what it was. It's all a relative thing.
I highly recommend this video. So as far as remembering them, the Chinese do remember what happened in Hankou. The objective was never to annihilate, and it was oppressive. It was definitely oppressive. You had a lot of malnutrition and disease, and people who were malnourished were much more susceptible to disease. So you had about 2,000 refugees died from disease. And then you had the nightly air raid drills that started in 1944. You had Victor Sassoon actually helped. He was working from India and Hong Kong. And also we had the Joint Distribution and other organizations. But the biggest group that helped were fellow Jews in Shanghai, the Russian Jews. And they also continued to supply war news on the radio. And it boggles my mind that this is still allowed. Now, this picture is something I took when I was in Shanghai, in Hankou, and the Chinese learn about this story in their school. More about that at the end of this program. So the ghetto was controlled by the Japanese. As far as getting out of the ghetto, you had to get a pass, and then there were two officials, and this one is Goya. He was a character, and he called himself the King of the Jews. You could go to work or go to school outside, but you had to get a pass to leave, and you had to wear the badge to identify that you had a pass. You had a little badge saying, "I have a pass." He made it difficult. He was arbitrary. Some people gave up waiting in long lines and gave up jobs, but there were no yellow stars and there were no armbands. One of the big issues is a lot of the Russians had businesses in the hospitality industry. That means evenings. And there was a curfew. So if you stayed past curfew, it was very difficult. There were beatings. More came from non-Jewish white Russians, but there were beatings. And the memories depend on your own personal experience. Now, I've talked to several survivors who had interaction with Goya. Let's read about it. And he was petite, okay, a petty tyrant who's also petite with a Napoleonic complex. If he didn't like how you looked, he might throw you in jail. And unfortunately, you better have a good immune system because typhus was rampant. If you were taller than him, he'd jump on the table and stand on his toes to make sure that he was taller than you. His biggest thing was slapping refugees, but he loved kids and teens. And I interviewed some who said he always gave them candy. Now, this story comes from a survivor named Bert Reiner. You may not be familiar with his name, but this was a man who invented Cabbage Patch Kids. So there's a poem play, and Goya is sitting next to Reiner and his parents. And Reiner said, well, Goya, like many Japanese, loved kids. I was maybe 5 years old, and Goya jokingly said, would you like a cigarette? And he held over a cigarette, and I pushed the cigarette out of his hand, and I said, no, you lousy Jap. And my father held his breath. He thought this was the end of our lives. Goya laughed at it. As tough and as cruel as he was actually kind to children. A bit schizoid in his behavior, and he was cruel. And he was mentally unbalanced, but this was no SS officer, and he did give passes, although he did give a hard time. He did allow cultural activities, and he and his subordinates even attended some of the concerts and plays, and he was only there for 1 year. And life in the ghetto continued, and weddings happened, and children were born, and there's my friend, the late Bill Sherman, one of the first people I ever interviewed, wearing his hat, and he was proud. He said, in Shanghai, you could be proud to be a Jew. And the big thing in Shanghai, and I've said this before, is that religion was openly practiced. Fortunately, among the refugees, you had 200 Jewish doctors. So although disease like typhus and dysentery were rampant, you didn't have as many dying as the Chinese. But the chief factor in making life bearable was the amount and variety of recreation. You had drama groups, you had light opera, you had bands and orchestras, you had cafes where Viennese gentlemen sipped coffee, and there were bakeries. Even though there was a great shortage of butter, somehow they managed. And there was a kosher butcher shop and German delicatessens and periodicals and newspapers in German, Polish, and Yiddish. You could get Shabbat candles, and you can dance the tango at Max Sperber's nightclub. And this was a little secret: at night, non-Jewish Germans would sneak into Hankou to get German and Austrian pastries and sit in the cafes. And Jews from many religious backgrounds had their ties to basic Jewish traditions renewed by being thrown together. The highly assimilated German and Austrian Jews once again found themselves going to synagogue. But the important thing was that in addition to religious observance, you had new editions of the Babylonian Talmud and other important works were published in Shanghai. You also had special financial support from the US Orthodox community that came by way of Switzerland. And the yeshiva students ate better and got new shoes. This is according to former student Sigmund Tobias, who I had the honor of interviewing. An interesting footnote in Yad Vashem that the Japanese actually financed and built a small synagogue next to one of their military posts in Hankou. And the Chinese never left, so the Jews weren't totally isolated. They were surrounded by people who had it so much worse, and all memoirs I read referred to the dead Chinese bodies, and all survivors recall hunger and malnutrition. And there was a lot of problems with the psychological adjustment that these people had. It was hard to get work, but if you could figure it out. You can get creative and somehow you could survive. You could still go to school. You could worship freely. You could study Torah. There was recreation. There was friendship and camaraderie. And again, through the Russian Jews, they learned news of Europe. And even before they heard about the camps after the war's end, they knew no matter how bad it was so much worse than in their former homes in Europe. These are some photos that I took in Hankou. I think it was 2011, now called Hankou, but that Jewish star was not put there to identify it as being a Jewish home. It was put there as a symbol of pride. And then the war's coming to an end, thanks to America and the air raids on Shanghai by American bombers. Now, in Hankou in particular, the water table was very close to the surface, so there's no bomb shelters. And finally, there was a major raid in July 45. And survivors recall how they would do artificial bomb shelters with beds and tables. 31 Jewish refugees were killed. Chinese deaths was over 1,000. Plus, you had people being wounded and being displaced. And the bombings continued until August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. That illustration on the top was done by the late Eli Wax, who we're going to see in the following video. There's nothing like firsthand survivors telling their story. And this is an interview with siblings, and they wrote a book like many survivors. What I find interesting is they talk about the differences in their experiences and recollections. I know many people who read a book called 10 Green Bottles. There are probably 50 books written about the ghetto, and they differ. And even within one book, you'll have different recollections, and hear two different stories.
We all didn't have any food. And what I remembered mostly was obviously of being hungry. I remembered that continuously. And also we lived in a one room. So I remember feeling secure as a child, but at the same time, not having any privacy. So, and I remember the tightness, and I remember my parents being in one area and Ili being on another. And we were pretty much on top of each other.
Wasn't difficult for me at all, because I always hated Vienna, because I experienced anti-Semitism before Hitler came. So I always wanted to leave. I remember I was 5 years old and said to my parents, why don't we go to America? Why are we staying here? I was radicalized at 5. So it was no problem for me leaving Vienna. And going to Shanghai was sort of, when you're young, it was an adventure. It was an adventure for our parents. They really had to leave a lot behind, everything behind. The whole lifestyle behind. We left with just 2 suitcases. We couldn't take anything with us. So it was a real culture shock, languages and everything. For my parents, they had memories of a different life, and it was different. All the generation had difficulty to adjust it. It was a language barrier. They didn't speak English. Forget Chinese. But so it was difficult. They used to come in at noon, every day at noon. And it went like this. First you heard the planes, and then came the silence. So one day they tried to hit the Japanese radio station, and they hit the Chinese market right inside the ghetto, and that was horrendous.
Yeah.
And that was one time I got a little afraid. Maybe we may not make it.
And it's interesting.
But it passed, actually.
At that time, it's interesting. I was 8, 9 years old, and they gave me a bag with a red cross on it. And bandages were in there, and I'm supposed to run out and help. And I thought, I saw all these people on rickshaws. Some of them had their legs hanging off, some had their limbs missing. And I really thought at the time that my job was to go find the limbs and go bandage them back together. I mean, really, that's what I thought. And that was my job. I ran around looking for pieces to, see who it belonged to. But I remember doing that, but you know.
Do you have a lot of those moments or times when you feel like you had very different experiences or very different reactions?
Yeah. Well, that's the story of the book.
Absolutely.
As a matter of fact, when we started the book, we didn't think about it as writing with different memories. We thought we were writing one book.
Yes.
And I thought what Deborah had written about Vienna, where our parents told her they're going on a vacation. So I said to her, what do you mean vacation? And then it occurred to me, leave it like that. These are her memories, and leave it like that. So it adds another dimension to the story.
I think I learned at an early age to be afraid, and I was pretty much afraid of everything. And I've always felt that at some point in my life, I don't want to be a victim.
The experiences were always out there for me, but you internalize them. So they affect your behavior, even if you don't think they do, in a way. And had some positive aspects of it. Positive aspect was when I ran into difficulties here, starting the business, and got fired a few times from jobs. My attitude was, if I survive Shanghai, this is nothing. You know, this is no problem, and that helps a lot. On the other side, still today, I'm still aware if I walk on the street at night and somebody walks behind me, I'm aware of it. I will cross the street.
For those of you from New York, Eli Wachs was the chief designer for Bonwich Heller, passed away a few years ago. So the Shanghai Ghetto is liberated September 3rd, 1945, and most of the Jews actually survived, including the 5,000 Russian Jews. And Jews started to leave. Jews started to leave, going to Israel, finally in 1949, America, Australia, and Hong Kong. And it's very quickly, Eli Wachs wrote a phenomenal book with his sister, and he talks about getting word about the Holocaust. He says there have been rumors and speculative murmurings, but most of us had nothing from relatives for years, and the jubilant mood inspired by our liberation quickly quieted, and a deep sorrow swept through the streets, touching every life. It took a while for us to see the images, but they made it to us eventually. Muddy's sister and the rest of her family were murdered at Dachau, and Mati wept. Everything we've been through paled in comparison. The hunger, the disease, the curfews, the poverty, none of it mattered anymore. We were lucky. Nobody gassed us. We had our lives. So Shanghai is free of the Japanese, and American money comes in, American GIs, and they start rebuilding, and Ort gets very much involved, and many of the refugees got jobs with the US military. Now, as stateless refugees, the Shanghai Jews faced difficulties with US immigration, with the quotas. The Displaced Persons Act, that focused on Europeans, and the Shanghai survivors were not eligible. President Truman spoke out, and he rectified it, and Jews were allowed to come to America. Now, the Mir Yeshiva students actually got priority due to successful campaigns by the Orthodox Jewish community in America, and actually the help of the new Polish government, who reissued passports, and they were able to come to Brooklyn, where the Mir Yeshiva continues today. The Soviets came to the Russian Jews, offering them passports, seducing them with propaganda, but the majority had no desire and did not return to Mother Russia. After the war, the truce between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong ended, and the Mao is marching on Shanghai, and the Russian Jews are trying to get out. They're very anti-communist. They're trying to get out. A call goes out to the world to save these Jews. And what did America say? No, of course. Who came to the aid of Israel who came to the aid of Jews in Shanghai and in Harbin with 7,000 visas? 3,000 of them were for Shanghai, Israel. Now, this is the part where I usually start crying, but I think I've done this enough to control myself. But imagine these Jews and what they've been through and what they know that their families have gone through. Imagine their amazement when a ship flying the Israeli flag comes up the river to rescue them from the oncoming communist onslaught. So the refugees fled, Jews are gone, but Jewish cultures returned to China, and it's by the Chinese. It's by the Chinese. In 1992, Israel and China established relations. They have very strong relations, by the way. They have in Israel, I've actually visited think tanks that were populated by Jews and supported by the Chinese government. But you also have an interchange between Israelis and other Jews and the Chinese academics studying this odd little Jewish settlement that flourished in the midst of China. The man you see here, he oversees a very large Judaic studies program at Nanjing University, and the Chinese teach the Holocaust to their children. Now, there's a very well-loved animated movie called A Jewish Girl in Shanghai. Again, you could get it on YouTube. I'm going to play the trailer without the sound, but I'm going to explain something first. The hatred that the Chinese had, and rightfully so, of their Japanese conquerors produced an exaggeration. The Japanese did not cooperate with the Nazi persecution, and they didn't have tapestries made out of Jewish women's hair. There it goes. Now you see why I'm not going to play the video, it's in Chinese. Okay. So basically they're talking about the Nazis. They reference it. And they tell the story of refugees fleeing. And being a children's story, somehow the children get to Shanghai. The mother tells them, Shanghai will take you in. Mother's being arrested, and the children somehow get to Shanghai. Again, it's a children's story. So there's a little Chinese boy, and he's selling basically scallion pancakes. And this little girl, that's Raina, is hungry. And of course, she has no money. So she gives a locket that her mother gave her to buy pancakes for herself and her brother. He knows that it's valuable. He has to find her. So he reaches out to this little girl to invite her to the Dragon Boat Festival there. Meanwhile, he sees his uncle who comes to visit. And his uncle is like a father to him. His own father was killed by the Japanese. So the little girl, Raina, and her brother come to have the dumplings. Now, this is the area that's a tapestry carpet made of hair. This is an exaggeration. So the little girl is playing her violin. And they want to play the songs of the Japanese army. Again, this is a bit of an exaggeration. and gives her back the necklace. They arrest his uncle. Again, they're showing the cruelty of the Japanese perpetrated against the Chinese, which was pretty horrific. But being a children's story, this has a very happy ending. The war ends, and miracle of miracles. The children are reunited with their father. And they leave. And I'm going to try not to cry at the end, but I do. I've done this 100 times and I cry at the end. So the little girl's leaving. But 60 years later, let our children know the story. And what you see there at the end is Ohel Moshe Synagogue and the Jewish Refugee Museum. There are 2 synagogues. Actually, there's more. Chabad has been very, very active in Shanghai. And I was there about 3 years ago on a tour, because I also went to Tibet. But friends of mine who were on the tour were kosher, and they actually could find kosher food in Shanghai, believe it or not. So the Ohel Moshe Synagogue was opened up again, and they put in this incredible museum, 4 times larger than it was before when it reopened in December 2020. When I told my Chinese staff that I was a Jew, I was told how they strove to be ethical business people by studying Talmud. And then when I told a new acquaintance in Shanghai about 3 years ago, he thanked me profusely for Israel's assistance after a terrible earthquake and how proud he was of our mutual history. I've been told that the greatest civilization is, of course, the Chinese. Second to the Chinese is the Jewish civilization. So thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Do we have any questions?
If you have questions, please remember to unmute yourself. Okay, Helene, thank you so much. Roberta, you want to say a few words?
Yes, I do. I want to thank Helene for raising our awareness of this important and widely known part of Jewish history. I thank everyone for joining us for this wonderful program. And please look for Sisterhood on the Congregation Kol Me website to find our upcoming programs. I want to wish you and your families a Shana Tova and all the best for everyone and everything in the new year. Good night, everybody.
Health first, then happiness will follow. Thank you all. Shana Tova to all of you.
Thank you so much for coming tonight, everyone.
Thank you.
Catherine Benzing, you need to unmute yourself.
I just would like, I really enjoyed your talk and I have read a couple of books about it, but do you have some recommendations?
That's interesting you say that, because I was going to add, I'm going to send a list. I have a lot of books to recommend. I have this an incredible video. There's an absolutely incredible video. I think it's free on Amazon Prime or YouTube, called Conspiracy of Kindness, about Chiyun Sugihara. Amazing story of him. But there's so many books out there, and you know, people in my own synagogue, my own sisterhood, had read 10 Green Bottles and said, you know, that's the whole story. There's so many different stories, and I've actually had the pleasure and the privilege. In fact, I did a program for Benny Rock in Miami Beach, I did a program for them, and I got an email from a gentleman who found out about it, and he's in Argentina, and he was a survivor. And he came on and he spoke and he showed us pictures of the house he lived in. And it was a wonderful thing, you know, to learn more about this. But I'm going to send the synagogue, Roberta specifically. I have a full page list of articles, of YouTubes, of videos, and of course of books. There's also an amazing book that I read. Which one is that?
I'm reading The Last Kings of Shanghai.
Oh, it's amazing. That's a fabulous book. I just read that. But there's also, I sometimes get out of print books. And I got this out of print book, which I wish was in print. And it's called To Save a World. And it's about the worldwide Orthodox community who did not stand by. And these rabbis who bribed Nazis, they said, how can we save Jews? We'll pay for it. They raised money. They bought Jewish lives. Went to the Nazis and they actually bought lives. They did things on Yom Kippur to save a life. It's just an amazing book. And I just wish it was, it's out of print, but it's just fantastic. There's a lot of books that are out there that you can still get. And again, it's, you know, we're about to lose these people. We're allowed to lose a lot of these people. And, you know, just to keep it, you know, the door to door, to keep from generation to generation, and know that there are good people out there, that there are good people out there. So I will send that list. You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
I have a quick question. Helene, have you ever interviewed or run into Betty Grebichenko?
No.
Okay, she lives in St. Pete and has family in Tampa, and she speaks often in this area. She's a friend and neighbor of mine, so I just...
There's some woman she's 93, wrote a great book, lives in Kings Point in Delray, but she's, you know, I tried to get her to interview her, but she's not available. But there are still people out there. Sigmund Tobias wrote a wonderful little book, and I actually had the pleasure of interviewing him when I did my first program in New York City. And okay, so I did it in Manhattan at a Reformed congregation in Manhattan, and the local Chinese press came to cover it, which I found amazing. The Chinese press in New York City send camera crews and reporters to cover this. And it's an amazing story. You know, the relationship between, this is not political, this is just realistic what happened. The relationship between China and Israel goes back to Henry Kissinger. And he said, I can't facilitate it, but I can put you in contact with those who can. And there's an actual very strong relationship. I had a distributor in Haifa, and he talked about the business he did with China. And I actually got to visit a think tank in Israel. See, okay, so if you say to the Chinese, whoops, I don't want that. You say to the Chinese, copy this bottle. We had factories in China and 5 factories in the US. We had some in China. And I say, make 1,000 of these bottles and they'll copy it. If I say, okay, I want you to invent something that you can carry around and drink water from, they'll send it to Israel to invent something. That's the relationship that they have, which I find very, I mean, I was in manufacturing, so I found it amazing. But it's a great story. And I did this in time. That's great when I show, you know, some synagogues and some sisterhoods say cut the videos, you know, particularly the interviews. I find them so important to hear what people, and that adorable woman on Chinese TV, you know, she just was adorable when she talked about, and the fact that you had a Chinese TV network saying never again, you know, that's an amazing thing to me. So anyway, thank you all very much. I will send Roberta that list, and there's great stuff. I'll send the list so you can pass it around to your membership.